to move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This evening I want to make the case for a complete and total overhaul of the way in which flood risk is assessed and taken seriously as part of the planning process, using the circumstances of the village of Ickford in my constituency as a case study to highlight the horrendous deficiencies in the system as it stands. I need not remind the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the devastating effects of flooding can be seen year on year, with the Environment Agency's October 2021 report projecting that double the number of properties in England will be in floodplains by 2065. New build housing increases the risk, further exacerbating the issue. 4 million people and £200 billion worth of assets are at risk of flooding from rivers or the sea in this country. The effect of flooding, both economically and traumatically, on individuals, families and businesses is both terrible and long-lasting. Flooding goes right to the heart of our communities, and it is a risk that must be taken seriously, and I know this government wants to take seriously. Acting ahead of a flood event is the most effective way to reduce the risk of floodwater damage. Typical improvements include low-cost resilience measures such as upgrades to plaster and flooring, self-closing air bricks, ceiling brickwork, and the installation of flood doors, all proven to reduce damage from flooding. But fundamentally, we must ask ourselves, how on earth new build homes are being granted planning permission in areas where literally everyone, other than it seems authorities, see that it is obvious they will flood or exacerbate the risk of flooding to existing homes and businesses. Madam Deputy Speaker, we need, in fact, communities across my constituency demand much greater consideration for flood risk in the planning process. And that is what I'm principally arguing for today. Amendments to planning laws that will force the system to properly undertake flood risk. Changes that would mean decision-making on development is taken as locally as possible and place flood risk as a central principle in any new planning legislation. We need to ensure that developers and the construction industry do not add to the problem, and that local authorities do not see building on flood-prone areas as an easy way in which to meet their housing quotas. This need was made urgently apparent to me as a result of events in the village of Ickford in my constituency. In August 2020, a development in the village of Ickford, now being built out by Deanfield Homes, but formerly started by Carla Homes, of 66 properties, was given permission to build by the planning inspector. An absolutely ridiculous decision, given part of the rationale was a totally bogus and irrational claim that flooding would not be an issue. Residents of Ickford were told that flooding would be a once-in-100-year occurrence. An offensive claim, given the number of times the village has flooded in the last 18 months alone. Indeed, when I visited the site in January this year, half the site, literally half the site, was substantially under water. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not talking about a couple of small puddles or a patch of laking, but widespread, deep flooding. Over 80 residents of this beautiful small Buckinghamshire village objected to the development, and their main objections were all consistent. Their primary complaint, flood risk. As I've said, the village already floods frequently during periods of heavy rain due to surface water runoff, and the development site is higher than most of the village. Much of the lower areas are in the floodplain of the River Tame. Even now, after all of that, quite amazingly, Deanfield Homes, the developers, have not accepted the indisputable proof that the development site floods. Or have they? For when I was standing in the flooded waters of Ickford, I believe that I was not the only one seeking a solution. Of course, my solution was simple: do not build on that field. But the developer seemingly had different ideas. If you build it, they will come, has suspiciously become, if you raise it up, they will still sell. A field of dreams becoming a field of nightmares for the villagers. Indeed, it is beyond parody, Madam Deputy Speaker, that whilst continuing the public "it'll be fine" line and narrative on flooding, the developers are in fact now building those homes 1.1 metres higher than previously given planning permission for, and we can all guess why. Residents have told me, in fact, I myself have witnessed, lorries full of aggregate and hardcore being delivered throughout the day, mounting curbs, putting children on their way to school in danger, building that site up so much higher. So now Ickford has a new development on an island that makes the threat of flooding to the rest of the village, especially properties on Worminghall Road and Golders Close, extremely high. The developer's new sparkly CGI graphics boards on the entrance to the development now even show the rear gardens with huge grass slopes, meaning all surface water will now flow directly towards the existing housing. They are not even trying to hide it. I've suggested to the developer that if they're so confident that flooding won't be a problem, that they should build a tanked brick wall around the development. But so far there has been no response, no agreement for my request for a meeting. So what they have done, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to alleviate the situation for themselves, but compound it for the rest of the village. This is equally all part of the blatant disregard the developer has for the village that they are devastating. The impact on biodiversity, for example, has been equally staggering. Residents have shared with me images of trees being cut down, hedges removed despite being protected, and the developer not even willing to hear their concerns. And compounding these issues, the village also has an inadequate sewerage system, and during periods of heavy rain, the Thames Water network simply cannot cope due to surface water ingress, so that raw sewage bubbles up into the roads. I've been pushing Thames Water for a solution to this, and to be fair to Thames Water, they agree that something needs to be done, but as of yet, no works have taken place. I'm sorry to say that these chief objections about flooding and sewage were simply laid aside as part of the planning process. And I've equally been told by residents that attended that the inspector's hearing itself was conducted in such a way that the inspector failed almost completely to control the hectoring by the developer. At the outset, residents were only allowed to make such brief speeches in support of their objections that they got shouted down, and the residents attending, leaving that hearing in a state of shock at such an undemocratic process, went home utterly disheartened. The inspector did visit the village on the last day of the hearing and talked to a few residents, but from his report it is clear that he paid scant regard to their concerns, though he did pay lip service to them. Surely, when any planning application comes forward, we must put local people at the very heart of flood risk assessment. Those who live and work in an area know exactly what happens in heavy rainfall, or even light rainfall, not some bureaucrat perusing Google Maps. Sadly, the inspector's report published in August granted permission for this development. Residents who had opposed the development proceeded to launch a campaign to protect the village, and they called it the Ickford Residents Group. The group sought legal advice, but they learnt that because their main objections had been set aside, they could not challenge the decision of the inspector with any hope of success. And since that time, the residents' group, of course, has been proved right beyond any shadow of a doubt that all of their objections were in fact valid. Thames Water have accepted that their advice at the time was wrong and are carrying out reviews, but equally, despite constant pressure from myself and residents, we have not seen any action. The group has also campaigned to obtain reforms to the processes so that other localities may not suffer as they have done. On behalf of Ickford residents, and indeed all communities threatened by flooding and road developers, I am today calling for the way flood risk is assessed as part of the planning process to be seriously beefed up. My view is simple. We can't keep building homes in areas liable to flooding. It will just keep making matters worse. Change is needed, and it is needed urgently. Firstly, the government should, as part of its review of planning policy, establish to what extent flood risk is increased by the lack of scrutiny given to the cumulative impacts of smaller and permitted development. A stronger and direct presumption against developments in floodplains is also needed. This requires changes to the national planning policy framework to close loopholes that allow developments in flood risk areas. And consideration must also be given to future insurance costs in planning and development decisions. Furthermore, mortgage lenders in the United Kingdom generally require mortgage holders to purchase buildings insurance which covers for flooding. Therefore, if new homes do not provide an appropriate standard of genuine and real flood mitigation, then the ability to get insurance cover and for people to become homeowners will become diminished. New standards could be set through building regulations that build on the industry code of practice for property flood resilience. Other measures like flood performance certificates should also be considered to incentivise responsible development, planning and property flood resilience measures. And I fear that additional spending on flood risk management will equally be required, and flood resilience measures need to be incentivised. The village of Ickford, Madam Deputy Speaker, illustrates the incredible inequality that is created when developers with very deep pockets come up against councils and local residents. Unless proposed reforms can overcome this undemocratic situation, then such unfairness will continue unabated. The setting aside of Ickford's residents' chief concerns was due to a virtually complete lack of local knowledge or testing of that knowledge by the authorities involved, and we simply must improve on that. As I said earlier, every single one of the concerns residents set out has proved to be real. Ickford was devastated by floods last winter, and part of the land that developers are building was flooded. That claim of the once in 100 years occurrence almost became once a week in reality. We simply have to look at this again. We simply have to learn the lessons of what we have seen in the village of Ickford, understand the threat that the existing homeowners, the existing properties in that village now face from this new development, and ensure that it can never happen to any other village or town or city or hamlet in our country ever again.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I should begin by congratulating my honourable friend for securing this adjournment debate on a very important topic to residents in Buckinghamshire, but particularly to his constituents. He is a doughty and industrious campaigner on behalf of the people of Buckingham, and specifically tonight the people of Ickford, and I congratulate him on his speech. I will tell him now, I'm sure he'll appreciate that because I have a quasi-judicial role as planning minister, it would not be appropriate for me to discuss in any detail individual planning applications or individual local plans. But I will say that I am concerned to hear from him that the developer in question has not engaged sufficiently with the local community, or, as he says, with him. And I'd encourage that developer, indeed all developers, to make sure that they do engage effectively and properly with elected representatives as well as the communities concerned. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government recognises that flooding risks present a risk to people, to their homes, to villages and towns and cities, as my honourable friend says. The devastating effect of flooding can be seen every year, and the government takes it very seriously. The National Planning Policy Framework is very clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that flood risk assessments are needed for all areas where development is proposed that are at risk of flooding from all sources, both now and in the future. Appropriate design and risk considerations that include an allowance for climate change need to be included in any flood risk assessment. Allowances that consider future effects of climate change on flood risk incorporate a precautionary risk-based approach for more vulnerable areas. And this means that increased levels of resilience are, indeed must be, factored in. The National Planning Policy Framework sets out a clear overarching policy on flood risk. It states that inappropriate development in areas at risk of flooding, whether an existing or a potential future risk, should be avoided, and where possible, alternative locations at a lower flood risk should be identified. And this is known as the sequential test. Where development is necessary, and where there are no suitable sites available in areas with a lower risk of flooding, the proposed development should be made safe without increasing flood risk elsewhere, and this is called the exception test. Where these strict tests are not met, Madam Deputy Speaker, new development should not be allowed. Now, there are 3 national flood zones which are identified by the Environment Agency's flood map for planning. And I'd encourage my honourable friend to raise his concerns about this specific matter with the Environment Agency and specifically about their flood map. Flood Zone 3, which is commonly referred to as high risk, is split into 2 separate zones by a local council. That's 3A and 3B, where 3B is classified as functional floodplain and has the highest likelihood of flooding. Large parts of many major towns and cities comprise land classified as Flood Zone 3. Subcategory 3A covers land having a 1 in 100 or greater annual probability of river flooding, or land having a 1 in 200 or greater annual probability of sea flooding, not possibly an issue which his constituents in Buckingham are at any particular risk to, but I understand his broader concerns. I must stress that building on land assessed as high risk is not the same as functional floodplain. And even then, building in Flood Zone 3 is not common, as less than 0.2% of the land used in Flood Zone 3 is residential. Flood Zone 2 is classified as medium possibility of flooding, and Flood Zone 1 is classified as low probability of flooding and covers land having less than a 1 in 1,000 annual probability of flooding from rivers or the sea. Now, areas at lowest risk of flooding can still experience localised flooding, for example, following a very heavy downpour. And that's why we've prioritised the use of sustainable drainage systems for all developments in areas at risk of flooding. The framework is also clear that sustainable drainage should be incorporated in all major developments, commonly schemes of 10 or more homes, unless there is clear evidence that this would be inappropriate. The framework is also clear that site-specific flood risk assessment should accompany all proposals in Flood Zone 1, the lowest risk, which involve sites of 1 hectare or more, land which has been identified by the EA as having critical drainage problems, land identified in strategic flood risk assessment as being at increased risk in the future, or land that may be subject to other sources of flooding where its development would introduce a more vulnerable use. Local flood authorities, lead local flood authorities, must be consulted on surface water drainage considerations and applications of all major new developments, and their comments and advice should help inform the local council's decisions on planning applications and ensure that those planning applications are in line with the NPPF on flood risk. And this ensures that local councils have access to appropriate expert advice on sustainable management of drainage and localised sources of flooding. For any major developments within flood zones 2 and 3 where the EA raises objections on flood risk grounds, the local council is required to consult the Secretary of State if they are minded to grant planning permission against the agency's objections, and this provides the Secretary of State an opportunity to call in the decision. Now, my honourable friend asks what we have done. He's called for a major overhaul of the system. Well, I can tell him that we updated the NPPF framework in July this year to ensure that planning policies support climate change mitigation and adaptation. And this includes tackling flood risk. As part of this update, the framework was amended to make sure that all sources of flood risk need to be considered. And this includes areas that are at risk of surface water flooding due to drainage problems, and that future flood risk needs to be taken into account to ensure that any new development is safe for its lifetime without increasing the risk of flooding elsewhere. The framework is clear that areas at little to no risk of flooding from any source should always be developed in preference to areas at higher risk of flooding, as I have said. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the framework must be taken into account in the preparation of local plans, and it is a material consideration in planning decisions. My honourable friend will know that as part of our wider planning reform considerations, we want to put local plan making at the heart of development, and we want to make sure that we engage more local people and stakeholders, and I can assure him that we'll be looking at that and the issues that he raised as we advance those proposals. I should also tell him, Madam Deputy Speaker, that as can be seen from the recent update to the NPPF, the government is not standing still on the issue of flood risk. Last year, we published a policy statement which sets out the government's long-term ambition to create a nation more resilient to future flood and coastal erosion risk. The policy statement outlines 5 ambitious policies and over 40 supporting actions. These will accelerate progress to better protect and better prepare our country against flooding in the face of more frequent extreme weather as a result of climate change. We want to ensure that we are better protected to reduce the likelihood of flooding and to increase resilience. Also this year, the government published its review of policy development in areas of flood risk. This examines key elements of planning policy relating to flood risk and development. And it concluded that the government has robust measures in place to protect people and property from flooding, which all local planning authorities are expected to follow. The review outlines the findings and sets out the actions the government will take and has already taken, which includes further clarifications of policy. I'm mindful of what my honourable friend has already said. As part of our wider ambitions for an improved planning system, we intend to review the NPPF to ensure that it contributes to climate change mitigation and adaptation as fully as possible. And I will take careful note of his suggestions in this regard. We're also in the process of reviewing the planning practice guidance section on flood risk to provide further clarification. I should also tell him that we're investing to improve our country's resilience to existing flood risk. This year, we've made record investments in flood and coastal defences, doubling the size of the flood and coastal defence programme in England to £5.2 billion. That'll provide around 2,000 new defence systems to better protect a further 336,000 properties. This aims to reduce national flood risk by up to 11%, helping to avoid £32 billion of wider economic damages and benefiting every region of the country, including his own. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, the Government has committed to undertake a review of the case for implementing Schedule 3 to the Flood and Water Management Act 2010 concerning sustainable drainage systems. And this will look at the benefits and the effects of implementation, as well as alternative methods for ensuring that sustainable drainage systems are incorporated in future developments. The review will engage a range of stakeholders, and I encourage my honourable friend and his friends to be some of them. As well as the schedule and providing for statutory build standards for sustainable drainage systems on new developments, it would also make the right to connect surface water to foul water conditional on local planning approval of the developer's proposed drainage system. The review, Madam Deputy Speaker, commenced in October this year, and we expect to publish the outcome in August next year. Can I again, Madam Deputy Speaker, congratulate my honourable friend for his persistence in pursuing this matter, this very important matter, on the part and on the behalf of his constituents. I hope it's clear to him that the government takes the issue of flooding very seriously and expects it to be an important consideration in the planning system. We also take his views and his concerns very seriously too. The NPPF is clear that inappropriate development in areas at risk of flooding should be avoided. Where development, as I say, is necessary, it should be made safe and resilient without increasing flood risk elsewhere. National planning policy applies to all sources of flood risk, including surface water, overwhelmed sewers and drainage systems, as well as future risk. We are committed to reducing the risk that flooding poses to our communities. We acknowledge that climate change will increase the risk of flooding, and that's why we have strong protections in place, including that £5.2 billion of investment which I previously referred to, and we will work hard on our further reforms to ensure that we further protect our communities against flood risk. I congratulate him on his work on behalf of his constituents in Ickford and elsewhere. I trust that the developer to whom he referred is listening and will engage with him and the communities that are affected at the earliest opportunity. I congratulate him on his debate, and I look forward to working with him in future to ensuring that flood risk in all of our communities is effectively mitigated.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Order. Order.